Welcome back to Torah on the Go. Whether you are walking the dog on the Peloton, we're awfully glad that you've decided to spend a few minutes with me and Rabbi Feinstein studying Torah.
Hi.
So we are getting to the special effects of the Ten Commandments story. Here we are in the Exodus narrative, and we're going to talk a little bit about the plagues. So the 10 plagues are, and I wrote them down to myself because I thought it'd be awfully embarrassing as a rabbi if I forgot any of the plagues. We have blood, frogs, lice, wild beasts, pestilence. Those are the first 5. Second 5, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and of course, Makat Bechorot, the slaying of the firstborn sons of Egypt. I have understood these plagues. The rabbis have a field day explaining the order of the plagues, explaining why, how, how they were enacted. You know, this is like going on the backstage tour at Universal Studios and getting to see how the movie magic gets made. But the truth is that there is an appeal. There's a wonder in all of the plague stories. There is a, just like we talked about possibility last week, there is a possibility of wonder of God's power in the world as you study the plagues. Each and every time you read the plagues, and we talk about them not only this time of year, we talk about them during the Passover time of year, Passover Seder. Where do you go when you consider whether it be blood or locusts or hail, or where does your mind go?
It's great. It's a good question. I like to think of that. Maybe this is just because of my own prejudices, but I like to think of them not as punishments, but as consequences. That is, there is some connection, moral connection, between each of the plagues and what Pharaoh had done to the Israelite people. Now take the first one. Pharaoh throws Jewish babies into the Nile, and so a river of blood flows through your country, through your town, through your city. Pharaoh tries to delimit the fertility of the Jewish people. That's how this whole thing started. He was afraid of our spread as a population. And so frogs, which belong in the wet, find themselves on the dry. They proliferate everywhere. There's no limitation. Each one of these plagues has some element in which it's midah keneged midah, says the Talmud, measure for measure. It responds to the social immorality of Egypt, darkness. Talmud says it's a darkness so bad that nobody could see the other, which is exactly what slavery is. It means it's a social condition in which we don't see the humanity of another human being. Each one of these is a consequence. And the message, I think, is a painful message, which is social decisions have consequences. Social choices have consequences. Society invests itself in certain policies and practices. They come back to haunt us. That's what this narrative is about.
So that's really beautiful. I see it a little bit different. I don't think that it counters your understanding at all. We're taught in Pirkei Avot that the world was created through 10 statements. Mm-hmm. Right? So 10 times God says, let there be light, let there be, let there be, let there be.
Right.
And the world is enacted through 10 statements.
Right.
And then, as I've taught in my Talking Torah class, the world is deconstructed in the Noah story through 10 statements that run exactly in accordance with the 10 statements of creation. God begins to take the world apart.
Right.
Until he breaks the firmament and the waters begin to mend, and all of it ends up darkness is in the end, and the flood back to chaos.
Yeah.
In Exodus, we actually have the reverse of we're presented with the most powerful civilization on earth. God has to take it apart piece by piece. And God reconstructs civilization in Exodus through Aseret HaDibrot, through the 10 statements of the 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
And so we have this, history doesn't repeat, it does, but it rhymes pretty well. And so whether it be the creation narrative, the Noah narrative, the 10 plagues, or the 10 Commandments, we have here building blocks that are either assembled or pulled away from each other.
A wonderful drush.
And it's like the game Jenga.
Right.
It's like the game Jenga. And God, in each of these, we decide whether the spirit of creation is building something or whether the spirit of creation is, pulling it apart in response to the way that humanity is behaving in that moment.
That's a beautiful way to put it. You anticipated a wonderful drasha by the Sfat Emet, where he says, God creates the world in 10 statements. God put 10 measures of divine creativity, of order making, cosmos building into the universe, and then handed the keys to us. We human beings, in the generations from creation to the Exodus, we undid it all. And what the 10 plagues are not punishments. They're the consequences of undoing God's creative work. And then God says, I'm not going to fix it for you, but I'll give you the tools. And the tools are the 10 commandments. So now, if you want to keep your Seder guests quiet, match them up.
Right.
Match up the act of creation, the undoing of it in the plague, and the redoing of it in the commandment. So I'll give you the first one for free, okay? So we have a statement on the second day of creation where God separates land from water, separating land from water. Land goes where it belongs. Water goes where it belongs. So far, so good. Okay. Then we have a plague, frogs, where the things of the water end up on the land. The boundaries are messed up. And then how do you put it back together? Well, there is a commandment that says you will not commit adultery. Mm-hmm. Adultery means there are boundaries, or you will not steal. Right. There are boundaries. You observe the boundaries, and that was the problem. So if you do this, you set up a chart, and you hand one to everybody at your table, and then no one will complain that dinner's late. Because they're all trying to say, oh, I got 8 of them. I can't get the 9th one.
Right. You can't get your soup until you do all 10.
But see, what that midrash does is, to your wonderful point, is that it points out we had the power.
Right.
We had the power to undo creation, and we have the power to redo creation. And God says, that's your power. I'm just here to show you what you can do.
Now, we're both firstborns here. And I have to admit that each time I read these plagues, there's a scary nature to it. There's a shocking nature to it. And there's also a silly nature to it, right? Because all of us, especially rabbis, each year attend. I don't know how many seders we go to each year, but there's 3 or 4 ECC seders for our preschool. There's a kindergarten seder, and there's a this seder and a that seder. And so by the time we sit down to our own personal seders, we have seen children of all ages stand and talk about blood and wild beasts and darkness, and it's adorable.
And you sing the frog song.
And you sing the frog song, that's right.
And you throw ping pong balls at each other.
That's right, for hail. And in my house, my parents always bring gummy bears for the wild beasts that are thrown.
Bag o' plagues.
That's right,
the
bag o' plagues.
Product that you have to have.
That's right. And so all of it ends up being kind of playful by the time that we really imagine what it is. And then I get to the last plague.
Right.
There's nothing playful about the last plague. There's something so real about it.
Yeah.
And there's only several times in the entire scripture of the Hebrew Bible where God kills somebody's son as a response to their behavior.
Yeah.
Okay? Pharaoh this is one of those moments where Pharaoh loses his son.
Yeah.
And there's something we all of the silliness goes away. All the silliness goes away when we understand that the Malach HaMavet, that the angel of death actually travels through the streets of Egypt and slays their sons as a result. And it's for this reason why we don't celebrate the deaths of our even our adversaries, our enemies, even when perhaps it's just. We still never celebrate as Jews.
Right. I think, first of all, to justify, I think the silliness is, first of all, a very effective way of suppressing the reality of it. And I think it's part of the tradition. I mean, the rabbis have these midrashim where they say it wasn't 10 plagues, it was 50 plagues, it was 200 plagues. I think there's a little bit of playfulness in all of that because, gee whiz, look what's happening to the bad guys. But any one of those plagues, if you pay attention to it, it's completely chilling.
Right.
Because each one of them represents a loss of control. The things we counted on, we can't control. We can't depend on them anymore. I remember when COVID first started, and we were all terrified of this disease. I remember wiping down groceries and sticking close to home and not getting within 10 feet of another human being because we lost control of our environment. And each one of the plagues, from blood and frogs and all of them, represent a profound loss of control. And each one of them, if you just take a moment and think about it, it's absolutely terrifying.
And we just went through fires here in
exactly.
Southern California.
Loss of control.
Right.
That we assume, all right, live in a nice neighborhood. Nothing bad can really happen to it. And if God forbid something happened, I pick up the phone and call 911 in the friendly neighborhood. Fireman is there to take care of it for me. There are people watching out for me. And all of a sudden, nothing you can do. A complete loss of control of my environment, control of my person, control of my body. And then the one thing in life that, as you said wonderfully, it touches us so very, the protection of a family. You know, I can't control that. I can't protect my family. Pharaoh couldn't control his own family, protect his own family. That's what makes this so terrifying.
And so the plagues tell one story, and that's a story of whether we understand it as punishment or retribution or midah keneged midah or however they unfold, however you understand those 10 plagues, that's a story. On the second level, there's a story between Moses and Pharaoh all throughout the plagues.
Right.
They actually encounter each other 3 times during the plagues.
Yeah.
And there's an evolution to their meetings. Moses in the beginning is begging for just 3 days to let the Israelites out for 3 days to go worship in the desert. And by the end, Pharaoh says to him in the last meeting, "Okay, you asked for several days. I'll give you several days. Who's going to go? Just the men? That's all." Pharaoh's imagining a very machmir service going on in the desert, right? You just have a men's section, right? Moses says, "Actually, no. I'm going to bring the men, the women, the children. We need animals. Everyone's leaving Egypt, and we're not coming back." And what it shows is that Moses becomes more politically astute.
Yeah.
Let's say he understands that the winds of change are at his back. Suddenly, he can push for more, and pushing for complete and total freedom, complete redemption, might not have been explained at the beginning of the plagues. But by the end, there's a weakening of Egypt's hold over the Jewish people.
Yeah.
God's will has been shown. Perhaps the Jewish people themselves are changing. They understand that the possibility is right there at their fingertips, and they're open to following Moses for the first time out of Egypt. Moses senses that, and he pushes with all of his might to break Pharaoh.
Right.
And he does.
And you watch Pharaoh's will melt.
That's right.
And each time is this hardening of the heart. And at one point, the generals and his ministers come to him and say,
"Let them go.
We're losing Egypt.
Right.
Let them go. We don't need them. Why are you holding on to this?" You know, I remember when as a kid during the Vietnam War, and we knew that there was a drama going on in the White House because many of the advisors to President Johnson were telling him, "End the war. It's futile. It's not," and then he had to hold on to it.
Right.
He was once a leader establishes his authority on a policy, it's really hard to turn around.
Right.
Both ego is involved and authority is involved, and you wonder about what you've spent on it already and what going forward. It's so hard to turn around, and you just watch Pharaoh melting, the inner strength of this. And at the very end, of course, when he finally sends Moses off, he says, "Leave, go to your God, take your families, take your things, and bless me too."
Right.
The last line of that narrative is, "Bless me too." He's lost. He's a puddle. It's an incredible narrative about watching a human being reduced.
And in their last face-to-face, Pharaoh tells Moses to get out, and they will not see each other ever again. And Moses has the ultimate mic drop moment. In Hebrew, he says, "Ken shedibarta."
Yeah.
It says, exactly as you just said it, buddy.
Said it,
we will never see each other again.
Right.
There are so many great moments amidst the 10 plague story. And those moments, I don't want to say they get lost, but most Jewish people, even literate Jewish people, don't get the opportunity to sit and study this narrative.
Yeah.
Because we gloss over it, because most of us feel like we know it.
Yeah.
Because we feel like we know it because it's presented to us in the Haggadah
Right.
every single year. But it's not presented like that in the Torah. It's really not. There are such rich moments between not only the plagues, between Moses and Pharaoh, between Moses and God, between Moses and the Jewish people, between Moses and Aaron. Which one of them enacts which of the plagues tells us about their relationship in terms of them as siblings, as partners between Moses and Aaron, in terms of how they work together. There's so much richness here. The commentaries just explode during this section of the Torah. And I feel like it's an opportunity lost for most serious Jews. This is a section of the Torah that they don't get to sit with and savor. And it's only really 2 weeks of the entire year. All 10 plagues basically get explained in 2 to 3 weeks. By the third week, we really don't talk about the last plagues because it's a moment of freedom finally. And so for 2 weeks we get to sit in this rich tradition of this narrative.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that we have an opportunity to sit and savor it together.
Yeah, our teacher, so my Bible teacher at UJ was Sioni Zevet, a wonderful, wonderful teacher who wrote a lot about this. So his theory was each of the plagues destroys a piece of Egypt, and they progress through it. So by the end, there's nothing left. The hail destroyed the buildings. The locust ate all the vegetation. The blight killed all the animals. The Nile becomes poisonous. His image is that when we leave Egypt, we leave just a wasteland behind us. God dismantles Egypt, and the totality of the destruction, not just of Pharaoh's will, but of the country around him, is this symbol of divine power. Demanding the right, on behalf of whom? On behalf of slaves, who were the lowest, most inconsequential people in a society. On behalf of the slaves, God takes Egypt apart. It's a remarkable image.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful interpretation, and we have to hope that this kind of sense of justice and morality not only prevails in the Bible, but actually inspires generation after generation that justice and morality will prevail ultimately.
Yeah.
And instills in us a belief that in the end, no matter how powerful a civilization might be, right, it could come to its knees in the face of these kinds of forces. It stays with us today. It stays with us today and has inspired so many generations before, and God willing will continue to inspire so many generations. And so we leave these plagues, these 10 plagues, with the understanding that we're heading towards the 10 statements, Aser HaDibrot, the 10 commandments, in just a few chapters. And we leave Egypt with a sense of optimism.
Well, that moment too. I mean, what does it mean for a slave to pick up and leave? A place that you've been for so long, a place where you're rooted, not knowing what's out there. Not knowing what's out there. I mean, one of the sad questions of modern Jewish life is, why didn't more Jews leave Europe ahead of Hitler? And the answer is pretty simple. The answer is because they were rooted there. They had everything there. They lived there for generations and generations. The real question is the opposite question. What did it take to leave?
Right.
Whenever I hear stories, I want to say my grandparents left in 1930 something. I said, what did it take to leave behind? Family, traditions, friends, businesses, culture that you were rooted in. What did it take to leave behind? Everything you knew was normal for something you had no idea what was ahead of you. For them to pick up, so there's a tradition, that only 20%, only
Right.
1 out of 5 left. The rest, after all the plagues, stayed.
Right.
Because they were rooted there.
It comes from the Hebrew word chamushim in the Torah.
Exactly, which is astonishing when you think about it.
Right.
What did it mean to pick up and leave?
Right.
And that moment at the end of the plague narrative when Moses says, all right, we're going. And they pick up and leave. The movie makes a big deal of it. This is quite dramatic. But just the psychology of that moment. Right. What does it take to take your kids and say, I don't know where we're going, but wherever we're going, we have faith it's going to be better than this.
So what's that word, chamushim, just to focus on it for 1 second, there's many interpretations of what that word, we left chamushim. which means either that we left weak or we left 1/5 of what we were, based on the word chamesh. So either the commentators, the rabbis are reading this as chamush, like we're shriveled up, we're weak, or we're based a fifth of the population walked out. But whatever interpretation you follow, we didn't leave empowered.
No.
The plagues didn't empower us to become mighty, right? We left as a feeble people. We left as the enslaved people. We still hadn't changed in many ways. It's not going to be for a long time, actually, until we get to the story in the book of Numbers about the spies, where Moses and God realize this generation will in fact never change.
Except I want to just interrupt you for a second. Except for one thing.
Sure.
The blood on the lintel.
Yeah.
Which at my Seder table always occasioned the question, if Santa Claus can find all of the homes of good Christian children, why did God need a blood on the lintel in order to protect us from the destruction?
So before the 10th plague, just for everybody who's following along at home, right?
Yeah.
God instructs Moses to instruct the Jewish people to sacrifice the Paschal lamb the sheep, and to spread the blood, paint the blood on our doorpost,
right? Which
ends up becoming the mezuzah. Okay, now continue.
No, that's the question then. What did he need it for? And the best answer in the tradition that I found was God didn't need that. God knows where we lived.
That's right.
God had the mailing list. It's for us. It was the first act of liberation for a slave to say, I oppose the Egyptian regime. I'm going to spread this blood. I don't know what's coming tonight. I don't know whether this is going to save me or this is going to damn me. It's like putting up a big Jewish star in front of the Nazi German government.
There are stories of people who lit Hanukkah candles in Berlin and in Munich in 1938.
Right, exactly. It's a coming out,
right? We
would say today, coming out. And establish. It was the first act of liberation because it took such internal strength to say, I believe in possibilities of this liberation, and I'm going to associate myself with that.
By the end of this episode, we are, in fact, free. We're free. And we are out of Egypt, and perhaps this begins the scariest chapter of Jewish history, which is the walking in circles in the wilderness for 40 years.
But first, we have to cross that sea.
That's right. And so please, we look forward to you joining us next week when we will resume these studies at the banks of the Sea of Reeds with you. Have a wonderful week.
Stay well.